vocal cords, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this, our 91st Mrftt Hiv Sti echo session, where we're chipping slowly towards the 200, the 100 mark. It's like on a carnival Monday morning, chipping down the road slowly, getting to that magic number. So I'm welcoming everyone who has decided to join us today for this really important session, because I think one of the things we sometimes as caregivers we don't do is sort of think outside the box. We may be very compartmentalized in terms of how we view HIV and the care and support for people who live with HIV, because by training and by experience, we sort of thought to think in certain ways. And I think this topic actually came as a suggestion from one of our colleagues who said, when we threw it out, what thing would you be interested in listening to or getting some education about? She brought up the issue of climate change and HIV and how the two intersect. So we very much want to thank you for that suggestion, because it was a brilliant suggestion. And we want to welcome today Professor Jeremy Hess, Jeremy Johnson Hess. Professor Hess is Professor of Emergency Medicine, Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, and Global Health. That's a lot of hats at the University of Washington, and he will lead the didactic this afternoon. So Professor Hess, it's a real honor to have you join us and educate us on this really fascinating topic. So I'll turn over the session to you.
All right, very good, thank you. Well, it's great to be with you, and I'm excited to explore this topic with you.
Sorry, Professor Hess, I think you might be muted. I'm not hearing you.
I'm hearing him, don't understand.
Can other people hear me?
I'm certainly fine this moment.
Yeah, I'm hearing.
Yes, Prof,
Yes.
I can hear you pretty well.
Good. Go ahead, Professor Hess. We can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, let me know if there are any problems. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you, and more importantly, to think through this with you, because it's an area that really has not gotten a lot of attention or even really consideration. And I think it clearly warrants it. And so what I have prepared, I'm going to pull up my slides. I've prepared a presentation that covers the basics of climate and health, so that you all have an opportunity to understand how we think about the impacts of climate change on health very broadly. And so you also have some sense of how the climate is changing, what the impacts are on the health sector, and what the timing of those impacts are, because that's all very important when we think through these questions. And then I'll home in on questions related to climate change and HIV, cover the research that has been done, which is not extensive, and then hopefully have a lot of time for discussion around next steps. So I'm going to start out by talking about climate change and its impacts on health, giving you a general overview of both climate change and climate change health impacts, and highlighting some of the timing. We're starting to see significant impacts. They kind of lurch forward. We see this sort of stepwise pattern with a lot of the health impacts that we're seeing, but overall, it's quite an inexorable drive. And I'm going to, we are at University of Washington, a teaching institution, and we focus a lot on our students and trying to think about the skills and competencies that they need to develop to practice, not only when they graduate in the next few years, but also well into the future. And their careers are going to span much of this century. I don't know who all we have here and where you are in your careers, but there's definitely a cohort effect, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, among our students, where we see a really significant level of concern about climate change and health, for good reason. I think they are seeing that over the course of their careers that they're going to be dealing with a host of different challenges that are going to be pretty difficult to manage. We'll have continued population growth over that time, but then toward the end of the century, we're going to start to see population decline, which presents a separate set of issues. Over this time, we will see a significant rise in global average surface temperatures. We've seen about 1.5 degrees to date, and we'll see about 3 degrees total, maybe more by the end of the century. We'll also see significant sea level rise. We've started to see a bit of that, but it's going to be much more pronounced over the course of the rest of this century. And principally as a result of sea level rise, but certainly not only, we're going to see a grand uptick in migration. And this is going to be migration inland from coastal region. That's going to be transboundary migration as people seek refuge from some of these challenges and some of the political and other destabilization that's likely to occur as a result. And we're going to struggle. And that struggle is going to be theirs primarily to deal with. And so we need to work with them to help them prepare and get the insight, knowledge, and skills that they need to deal with these issues. I'm going to frame this by talking about risk. This is an image from the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's a framing that goes throughout climate change impacts work in the health sector and otherwise. And at the center is risk. And the components of risk include hazards, so environmental hazards like extreme weather, population vulnerability factors, which include both susceptibility to a hazard, so people who are more frail are more susceptible to adverse health impacts when they're exposed. Vulnerability also includes adaptive capacity, so the ability to anticipate and proactively and successfully respond to challenges associated with shifts in the climate. And then lastly, exposure. And exposure at base means people exposed to a hazard, though of course there are varying degrees of exposure. Someone can be exposed to a heat wave, but if they are living in an air-conditioned environment and working in an air-conditioned environment, and they are able to pay electricity bills for that air conditioning, then they are not really that exposed to the heat wave, as opposed to someone who lives in a non-air conditioned home and or works in a non-air conditioned setting or outdoors, or can't afford to pay the electricity bill for air conditioning, even if they have it. So exposure is, there's quite a spectrum there. And we have to be mindful of how we define it when we think about this. As you step away from that central risk propeller, you see that there are these feedbacks that impact risk over time. So emissions of greenhouse gases from various processes affect the climate, drive climate change. And when the climate changes, we have impacts on natural and human systems. Those impacts on natural and human systems, extreme weather events in particular, ultimately affect socioeconomic processes. They cause damages and economic losses that require that sap resources from other activities, including health. They can undermine governance, and they can, over time, make risk worse. Now, there are also pathways whereby investments in technologies and policies that reduce the likelihood of dangerous climate change or are protective in other ways can have beneficial effects, and over time they can reduce risk in the same way. And this cycle and this framework is important to a lot of thinking around climate change impacts. We, of course, have seen substantial climate warming to date. Right around 1980, we started to diverge in terms of global average surface temperatures from what we started to become confident that the divergence we were seeing was actually a true divergence from the historical climate. And as you can see from 1980 on, we've had a significant steady rise in temperature. And we are just in the last few years, this goes through 2020, but in the last 3.5 years since then, we've seen further significant increases in warming. And in fact, over the last several months, we've had a global average temperature of over 1.5 degrees from this baseline. So significant, rapid, sustained warming that we are quite confident is from human influence on the climate. And we can expect this to continue, even though we are making progress on reducing emissions. We will expect to see continued warming, potentially up to around 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And of course, this presents itself in terms of it being warmer, but we also see a host of other environmental shifts as a result. So we see reductions in soil moisture, which affects agriculture and affects land surface temperatures. We also see significant shifts in the hydrologic cycle, the cycle through which water circulates through the terrestrial and atmospheric spheres. And what you can see there is that certain areas will get a lot wetter, particularly in the tropics. And then certain areas will get significantly drier. And the two things can also coexist. So in California in the United States, for instance, we have seen a steady shift toward drier conditions and more pronounced period of drought. And you can see that in that third row there in the southwestern United States, there's this progressive drying. But then there also are periods, and we're in one right now, where they experience deluges and have significant increases in precipitation events. And as a result, they're actually having challenges managing flooding, storing all the water. It's not falling as much as snow as it used to, and a number of other things. So we're seeing significant changes in the hydrologic cycle currently, and we expect those to change going forward as outlined here. When might we see what? Well, this is, of course, accompanied with quite a bit of uncertainty, but in general, depending on the pathway we are on, we can expect to see a clear crossing of the 2-degree global average surface temperature threshold, probably around 2050. It may come before that, it may be delayed, but that's a safe estimate. We likely will see crossing of the 3-degree threshold by about 2075, if our predictions are sound. And then by the end of the century, we will be flirting with a 4-degree threshold. Again, this is assuming no significant introduction of new technologies related to carbon removal from the atmosphere, or no significant effort at geoengineering other than what we're doing with current greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is that I've been talking in terms of averages. So, an average warming of 1.5 degrees, et cetera. But it's not only the average that we need to think about. It's in fact the extremes that are associated with these shifts in averages. And for both heat and extreme precipitation, there's a bigger increase in the extremes than there is in the averages. And so, for instance, for an event that historically would have happened once every 10 years, we call this a 10-year event. With the warming we've had of about 1.2 degrees at the time that this figure was created, we actually saw a 2.8 times increase in those 10-year events. Similarly, you see a progressively disproportionate increase in extreme events as the world continues to warm. So at 1.5 degrees of average warming, we'll have a fourfold increase in 10-year extreme heat events, et cetera. Up to 4 degrees average warming, we'll see a tenfold increase in those 10-year events. And you see this even in an even more pronounced way with 50-year events. So events that happen, extreme heat events that happen once every 50 years on average. Those are now 5 times more likely than they used to be. And in a 4-degree world, we will see those kinds of events happen about 40 times more often than they did previously. And this is largely just a function of statistics and extreme value theory. And the way that this curve is both shifting to the right, but also reducing its variance, creating a very long tail on one end. Unfortunately, one of the things that we're seeing along with this, it's not just the climate that's changing. We're seeing a lot of other impacts on the planet from human activity. And this is the planetary health perspective that you may have heard about. And one of the significant shifts that we're seeing that interacts quite a bit with climate change is species loss. We're in the midst of a 6th great extinction and losing biodiversity at a really remarkable and lamentable rate. This has implications, of course, for ecosystem health, but also for food security, and for other things like the identification of new medicines. It's a really heavy blow to our ability to leverage what's in the natural world to promote human health. The increase in temperature alone poses significant risk to human health. And right now you can see places where the outdoor temperature poses risks to human health mapped on the left. And you can see how many days a year where conditions are quite hazardous. And right now, in most places, that is in the double digits where there's risk. But going forward toward the end of the century, you may see places where there is a persistent, every day of the year, very hazardous level of heat in the outdoor environment, which of course has major implications for agriculture and other kinds of outdoor work and productivity there, because people can't safely work when the heat is that hazardous. Similarly, we see significant impacts on food production. This is terrestrial and in the oceans and fresh water. We see with changes in temperature of these bodies of water and on land, and then also changes in precipitation and in water, we see shifts in ocean chemistry related to dissolved carbon dioxide in the water. And this increases or decreases the pH and makes conditions threatening for organisms that are low on the food chain, and so promotes food chain collapse in certain ocean ecosystems. So while climate change may benefit some agricultural productivity in the higher latitudes in the north and the south, in many places where we currently rely on for agricultural productivity, these shifts are threatening to food production. And so we actually are already seeing and expect impacts on the quantity of food that is produced certainly in areas where we currently produce, and also the nutritional quality of a lot of that food may be impacted by climate change as well. And as I mentioned before, this is quite, a generational issue that people who are toward the end of their lives currently are starting to see these impacts while they're vulnerable to extreme heat and other things. They are not really going to experience the brunt of these changes in the same way that someone who was born recently will, that person personified here, born in 2020, they'll be 70 years old in 2090. They will see the full brunt of these impacts. And I think as a result, the younger generations are really preoccupied with what we're doing about climate change, what we're doing to reduce the risk of dangerous climate change, and what we're doing to protect ourselves from any residual risk that remains after that action. I mentioned ocean acidification earlier. This shows what we are likely to see by the end of the century. Ocean acidification, differently than some of these other hazards, it's uniformly distributed. It's essentially an instantaneous change when you increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the air. They equilibrate very quickly with the water, and these shifts are quite pronounced and difficult for ocean organisms to address. Already seen that. Okay. Another challenge we face is sea level rise. By the end of the century, we may see about 1 meter, which is roughly a little over 3 feet. But with storm surge, we can expect to see flooding of this sort. So this is depicted as kind of sunny day flooding, not terribly likely for storm surge, maybe the aftermath of a severe storm. But we may well see impacts like this in our coastal cities when sea level rise is coupled with high tide and a storm surge. And I wasn't able to find much about Trinidad and Tobago in my research and sea level rise, but I did find this. So even with the current level of sea level rise that we have experienced thus far, there's a little bit of flooding risk by 2050. Going forward a bit and looking at what would happen with a Category 2 hurricane in the vicinity, you see that there would be significant flooding in many of the drainages in much of this part of the country. And then with a Category 5 hurricane, there would be really substantial flooding. So a lot of low-lying areas in Trinidad, and as is the case in much of the world, and this kind of flooding, particularly with saltwater, of course, is very damaging over time and causes a lot of impacts to human health, largely through lost infrastructure and through displacement, through destruction of arable land, and in fact also of saltwater infiltration into drinking water, which can cause hypertension and other problems. Overall, climate change impacts health through a really surprising variety of pathways. So at the center of this figure, you can see the different environmental hazards that are climate sensitive that I've outlined. And then here in each of the different rays, you can see pathways by which those changing hazards impact human health, whether it's through changes in air pollution, changes in the ecology of vector-borne and zoonotic disease, changes in aeroallergens, changes in water quality, changes related to nutrition and wash, and then some more indirect issues like forced migration, civil conflict, depression, anxiety, and then of course the heat-related issues and fatalities and other things from disasters. Now, of course, not everywhere will experience the same kinds of impacts. Certain hazards are more prevalent in certain places. Here in Washington, for instance, we don't really have substantial vector-borne disease. We don't have substantial morbidity and mortality from hurricanes or cyclones, but we have other problems related to wildfires, and places like Trinidad and Tobago probably don't suffer the same level of exposure to that. So Each location's population health impacts from climate change will depend on the underlying health status of the population, its demography, and then the climate-sensitive hazards that the population is exposed to. And there's a really significant equity dimension to this. And I argue that climate change is our leading global health equity issue. That there, at every level at which you examine the problem, there is a stark set of inequities. And this starts with the fact that most of the emissions that are changing the climate currently are from high-income countries, even though China is now the leading emitter. Historically, it was the United States and Europe that have really emitted most of the greenhouse gases that are have resulted in climate change to date. And yet, the impacts are on the people and the countries that are least responsible for the problem. So the mortality estimates for climate change are pretty substantial for low and middle income countries. Impacts on productivity in equatorial regions are really dramatic, whereas the global north not only has benefited from those emissions and the industrial activities that they fueled, but also in some cases is benefiting from longer growing seasons and other benefits that come with a shift in the climate, while countries in the global south have suffered. And we're already seeing signals of significant impacts everywhere we look. So this is an analysis of attribution of heat-related mortality the world over. And what we're seeing is a significant increase in mortality attributable to climate change. And this is, again, everywhere we look. We're also seeing, pretty much everywhere we look, significant impacts on worker productivity. This is particularly for outdoor work, and very pronounced in South Asia and East Asia, and then in certain parts of Africa. In the United States, and this mirrors trends in many places, we're seeing much more costly and frequent disasters than we have in the past. This signals, again, started to increase clearly, perhaps 20 years ago, maybe a little less than that. But we've now seen a very steady increase, particularly in hydrometeorologic disasters, which are particularly climate sensitive. And it's very, very costly. For the United States, we have had a very large number of billion-dollar disasters in each of the last several years. And these disasters, this accounting actually doesn't include health. And so if you were to include health damages, it would be all the more substantial. And I include mention of these because this impacts people's health directly through injuries and infectious disease and other things. But it also indirectly affects people's health. A lot of the losses that are outlined here are not insured, so people just have to absorb them. Businesses have to absorb them, and households have to absorb them. And of course, it reduces productivity in these impacted locations, and so that undermines health over time, and it decreases the national coffers and the resources available for other kinds of investments, including investments in health. So overall, when communities experience disasters that are severe and frequent, it really can quickly undermine their resilience. We're seeing, as I mentioned before, significant increases in wildfires on the west coast of the United States, but in fact, it's a global challenge, and we're seeing increased wildfire particulate pollution, again, everywhere that we are observing. We've also seen significant declines in yields of several staple crops globally, and this is due in part to shifts in temperature and extreme weather. And altogether, what you can see is that there are, I'm painting a picture not only of direct impacts associated with climate change, but a real risk to a wide range of health determinants across the spectrum. So impacts on food production, impacts on our ability to devote resources to education, to protect workers and maintain productivity, to maintain relatively low levels of unemployment, to invest in up-to-date water and sanitation infrastructure, provide healthcare, et cetera. All of these things are threatened by climate change, and all of these ultimately, if threatened, undermine population health. And unfortunately, in our last assessment of climate change impacts, we're starting to see, on balance, net negative impacts across a really broad range of sectors. So we're starting to see evidence of this coming to pass. And you can see it's impacting health through a number of different pathways, as outlined before, including infectious diseases, including heat. Increasingly, we're observing impacts on mental health, and we're also starting to see some impacts on population displacement. But again, going back to determinants of health, we're seeing impacts on a number of other sectors, and impacts from flooding, impacts from storm damage in coastal areas, infrastructure losses, and then impacts on key economic sectors, which on balance are negative. And this is a study from the United States. And again, I don't want to appear to focus overly on the United States, but it is a location where there's a lot of research that's been done, and it helps clarify the concerns that we should have for other parts of the world as well. So the United States, of course, is a very large country and has a lot of different climatic zones. And what you can see in this panel here is this is a projection of climate change impacts on a bunch of different sectors at the end of the century under a high emissions pathway. These are probably, we have learned since, these are, the pathway that they estimated is probably the emissions are too high. I mean, meaning they're higher than we'll likely see. So the impacts are probably a little more severe than we're likely to see, but the patterns overall are still worth examining. So what you can see is that agricultural productivity, which right now is concentrated in kind of the middle of the country and in this area, that we'll see significant drops in agricultural productivity at the county level, and then significant increases in these parts of the country where currently it's pretty cold and growing seasons are shorter. So while the net shift in agricultural productivity may not be dramatic, what will be dramatic is the losses associated with agricultural activity in these locations, and then the gains in a concentrated area of the country. Similarly, you can see losses associated with heat-related mortality will go up quite a bit in the southeastern part of the United States, which is already hot, and then probably go down in the northern part of the country. We'll see shifts in energy expenditures. We'll see more energy going into cooling in the southeast and probably less energy going into heating in the north. And we'll also see reductions in this case, low-risk labor that are fairly uniform, but more pronounced in the south. High-risk labor, so people who are working in the agricultural and construction sectors in particular, we see declines really across the country, but in particular, again, in the south. Same story with coastal damages. We have two big coasts in the United States, but we expect to see more significant coastal damage on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast as a result of sea level rise, increasing storm severity, and then also in many places, subsidence of land. So the land is going down, the sea is going up, and we're seeing more flooding as a result. Violent crime is actually also sensitive to temperature. And so we can expect to see more crime in places that are warming. So in this case, we'll see a little more crime in the north, both property crime and violent crime. When you put it all together, what you see is there are pretty clear winners and losers in this scenario. And the places that experience the greatest damages and probably the greatest impacts in terms of determinants of health are in the South. They're in our poorer parts of the country already. They're in parts of the country where we have a lot of Black Americans and where we have a lot of historical racism. And so there are a lot of reasons already to be concerned about environmental justice communities in these locations, and climate change is likely to make their health much worse. The other challenge here, you can see that there is likely going to be some differential impact by that could align along political affiliations. And so there potentially is some destabilization as a result of the required income transfers and other new dynamics that might unfold at a national political level. Of course, this is not unique to the United States, but something that climate change really may pose a threat of going forward. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about some of the other global impacts. We have already started to see some impacts on the likelihood of violent crimes and population level conflict as a result of climate change. And we have good evidence historically that climate change has led to societal collapse in a number of different societies on a historical scale. And it's not just climate change climate change alone is not sufficient to cause collapse. In fact, it's climate change in the context of hostile and unfriendly relationships with neighbors, a collapse of essential trading partners, unaddressed environmental problems, and then a reluctance to adapt. And overall, climate change does appear likely to increase volatility and make some of these international relations more challenging. And so I think these are things to not necessarily dwell on, but just acknowledge that they have significant world historical implications in terms of societal collapse. I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions. I know that was quite a bit of material, and I want to see if anybody has anything they'd like me to elaborate on. Nicole.
Hi, thanks for that presentation. That's pretty comprehensive. The crime piece is a piece that is new to me, so I appreciate that additional information. Any thoughts around the migration question, but specifically around the migration question as more women from the south of the equator decide to travel north of the equator to have children? Because we've gotten the information that as the space heats up, body temperatures are going to rise, of course, and that's going to be an untenable situation for baby making, to put it plainly. And how do we possibly look at the whole human rights question around that? Because I keep saying to persons, if I wanted to make some money, I could just make a determination to get maybe 10 to 15 women, impregnate them somehow, either via sperm bank or some other way, have them in a house, make sure they're fed, make sure they get their checks, and sell babies for $500,000 a pop on the black market. So, but any thoughts around how the different iterations around migration? I don't think it's just a simple thing about like what we've been seeing in Europe. I think it's going to be a major question. And how do we, both from a brain drain situation and also from a possible accepting country perspective as well?
Yeah, so a great question. I'll start off by saying I'm not a demographer. I'm not an expert in immigration. I do know people who work in that space. So if you would like to be connected with them, I'm happy to facilitate that. I was one of the authors on the IPCC's most recent assessment report on the chapter that brought together health, well-being, and the changing structure of communities. And that last piece, the changing structure of communities, was around immigration and health security and other questions. And it zeroed in on the questions that you're asking. And what we know as of right now is that we can't say with a lot of confidence that we're seeing climate change alone as the driver of internal or transboundary migration, or that it clearly has driven an increase in conflict overall, but that there's very clear reason to expect that that may occur. And there's also probably good evidence that climate change in conjunction with other shifts and political instability in many locations is driving quite a bit of the transboundary migration that we're already seeing. And there's no question that the world and is not really equipped to manage these migratory journeys very well at all, whether it's brain drain from countries that are losing people, whether it's the countries where people are transiting through, or it's countries that end up as destinations for migration. Really across the board, it's safe to say none of this is being managed very effectively. And so I think it will be something that the world will have to focus more of its governance on going forward. And that's going to be a challenge. One of the issues that I have overall with the climate community is that it has spent so much time trying to build evidence that climate change is happening and that it's caused by humans, and clarifying what is happening and what's likely to happen, that we're a little behind in terms of pivoting to managing the problems. And this is particularly the case for the health sector. But I think it also is the case for immigration, that we have not really set up any structures to start addressing these problems. Okay. So there'll be time for questions a little later too. I just wanted to pause there. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about implications for HIV/AIDS, both from an epidemiologic perspective and from a disease management perspective. So as I mentioned, there's surprisingly little science on this question. There's a lot of science highlighting the impact of climate change on the ecology of other infectious diseases, vector-borne and zoonotic diseases. Less work has been done on the social ecology of many diseases, infectious diseases, including HIV. The work that has been done, however, is eye-opening and suggests that we really should be paying a lot more attention to these questions, because they have significant potential to undermine the progress we've made in this space over the last several decades. And there are a number of different pathways that through which this might occur. They include an overall increase in population vulnerability, particularly among populations or parts of the community that already were more vulnerable, and growing health inequity. As we discussed, the role of migration and increased mobility and vulnerability of certain populations, and also difficulty in reaching those populations to provide services and prevention and care. The issue with undernutrition could have substantial interactions with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and challenges related to population migration, extreme weather event exposure. All of these things can undermine continuity of care. Then lastly, through all the pathways that I outlined earlier, HIV and AIDS are chronic diseases. It's a chronic disease at this point, and people with HIV are susceptible to a number of other chronic disease complications, and climate change may well undermine or increase risk associated with those diseases. So indirectly increasing morbidity and mortality in people living with HIV. And this is just a reminder of all the different ways in which we can expect climate change to impact population health in different locations. There are a couple different pathways that have been proposed in the last couple years, linking climate change to HIV/AIDS, morbidity and mortality. So here's one from Lieber and colleagues, and it highlights the different environmental shifts that we're seeing with greenhouse gases, temperature rise, sea level, et cetera. And then also some of these other planetary shifts we're seeing with deforestation and changes in land use and loss of biodiversity, that all of those things interact with these four pathways here: migration, infectious disease prevalence overall, loss of infrastructure and food insecurity, to increase the risk both of HIV/AIDS, increasing incidence, and then also increase morbidity and mortality. And then, as similar with that risk pathway that I outlined before, you see feedbacks into global environmental changes that ultimately can worsen the problem. Here's a more comprehensive pathway that specifies more of this, the intermediaries through which we might see impacts. It also introduces some pathways that the other one didn't mention, like air pollution. And so we are likely to see increases here in transmission of HIV, susceptibility to HIV, and then impacts on both morbidity and mortality associated with HIV. And we've actually started to see some observational evidence that supports these concerns. So those two things before were really more theoretical work. This work here looked at patient compliance, not HIV specifically, but a number of different kinds of subspecialty patients, their ability to maintain compliance as measured by no-show rates at a clinic. And they looked at extreme heat events and extreme precipitation events to determine whether there was a risk associated with extreme events, and found, in fact, that when it got really hot, there was a relationship, and when there was heavy precipitation, there also was a relationship. The relative risk is not dramatic, so roughly a 5 to 10% increase in no-show rate associated with these events. But as these events become more frequent and more severe, we can expect this to become more and more of an issue. And this can have significant implications, particularly for patients who are either difficult to maintain relationships with, patients who may have trouble getting to and from clinics, patients who live remotely, and patients who maybe have other challenges in their lives that get in the way of maintaining continuity of care. So this would exacerbate that relationship with them and, threaten interruptions in antiretroviral therapy and other kinds of life-saving care, like end-stage, like hemodialysis and end-stage renal patients. We're also seeing some interesting modeled evidence. So this is a model that Baker created in 2020, and it uses a SEER framework to examine effects of temperature on HIV incidence in sub-Saharan Africa. So it pulls a large set of observational data to create this model. I'm not going to go through all the different dynamics, but one of the things they looked at for women was changes in patterns of behavior related to number of sexual partners, incidence of sexual violence, likelihood of migration, and access to condoms relative to changes in temperature from baseline historical temperatures. And then for men, they also looked at number of partners. They also looked at risky behaviors like paying for sex. And then also, as with women, the likelihood of migration and access and use of condoms, and found clear associations between these different behaviors and temperature historically. So assuming those relationships hold, they put them into the model and projected forward with climate change what we might see in terms of changes in the incidence of HIV and thus the prevalence at any given point going forward. And we see across the board, a significant increase in HIV prevalence, driven again here only by temperature. They didn't model the other impacts of climate change. And that's somewhere between roughly 1% and 4% change in prevalence with shifts in temperature. And you can see here, I think the real risk over time, if you look forward and you project out climate change impacts on temperature, we may well see a significant erosion of the progress that we've experienced. And in a few cases, we actually may lose all of the progress that we've had on reducing HIV incidence in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, this is sub-Saharan Africa, so we generalized to other settings with caution, but you can see the clear evidence of progress in all of these places around HIV, and also the clear potential for undermining that progress going forward. So I think it's quite a strong argument, in fact, for examining some of these relationships and developing interventions to address them more effectively. Which leads us to the next part of the conversation. And in a lot of this work, most of the effort has gone into developing etiologic evidence, or evidence linking changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, et cetera, with changes in population health status. And as I said, that's important for making the case that there's an issue, but it doesn't help much with understanding what to do about it. And the box here on therapeutic evidence is that we really have very little therapeutic evidence. We, of course, know with HIV, we have a lot of therapeutic evidence around how to reduce incidence, but we don't have a lot of evidence around how to modify those protocols in order to accommodate these shifts in testing and care that may come with social disruptions and challenges to food security and migration and other issues. And we need that urgently in order to continue to make the progress that we've seen. We can reduce risks associated with climate change. We can reduce the likelihood of the hazard becoming dangerous through mitigation. We can reduce population vulnerability by increasing adaptive capacity, and we can reduce exposure to dangerous hazards by supporting early warning systems and relocation and other things like that. But we have to be very thoughtful and proactive about this. There is good information about how to make health systems more climate resilient, and I think this pertains to HIV/AIDS as much as it does to other climate-sensitive health outcomes. I'm happy to talk a bit more about that if the group is interested. Overall vulnerability reduction through efforts to attain the SDGs will have beneficial impact on climate-sensitive health outcomes. People are increasingly realizing that climate action is public health action, and that we should probably be prioritizing climate action more highly in our work on the SDGs. And they're also recognizing that while there's a significant impact narrative that I've spent a lot of time talking about, there's also a lot of opportunity here, that if we can quickly pivot toward renewable sources of energy and electrify and reduce particulate emissions and reliance on fossil fuels, it has immediate substantial public health benefits. And so there's a real opportunity here for promoting health through climate policy, which is important because if we don't reduce the likelihood of these very severe impacts across all these sectors, we will not be able to adapt to what's left. And we're making some significant investments in mitigation, and we're seeing we have bent the curve. We will continue to bend the curve. My mind, the question remains exactly how much we will reduce warming by the end of the century and how much residual risk we'll be able to manage. The Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change is an annual document that tracks health impacts associated with climate change and activities in the health sector. They outline a bunch of different priorities for a healthier future as the climate changes, accelerating fossil fuel phase out, including in the health sector, delivering health promoting climate change action in the health sector in particular, and then investing in climate change adaptation for health. And I would include HIV prevention and care here, and then also increasing capacity in terms of financial systems to support processes, including those related to migration, as we talked about earlier, to address the challenges associated with climate change. And there are a lot of opportunities within the health sector for thinking about how to merge adaptation and mitigation to promote population health. Adaptation by itself is important, mitigation by itself is important, but overlapping activities where that are beneficial to both adaptation and mitigation are particularly helpful for building resilience. And then implementation science. We really need to invest more in learning about how to implement successful interventions and doing it at scale. And I know it's something that we have worked on a lot in our Department of Global Health here at University of Washington, particularly around HIV/AIDS. And I think there's a real opportunity to apply that work to climate and health. One of the challenges, though, is that climate and health really doesn't have the catalog of effective interventions that the HIV/AIDS field does. And we also have a lot of challenges related to measuring exposure, measuring effect. Environmental health is not a field that has done this typically. It's not an infectious disease-oriented field that relies heavily on randomized evidence and trials and things like that. So it's having to learn new methods. And we don't always have all the information we need around effectiveness in order to drive this work. So there are a number of challenges here, but we really, really need to build out implementation science in this space. And if you're interested, I'd like to work with you on that, because we don't, climate change presents a problem of rates that we can't keep up with the rate at which climate change is happening and impacting population health. And the further behind we get, the worse off we'll be. So we really need to work on these issues in order to promote adaptation at scale and get to the point where we can provide really high-level evidence to support practice, a lot like HIV has done over the past several decades. So in summary, climate change, of course, is well underway. We're having significant population health effects already, and it's a threat multiplier. It's going to impact HIV/AIDS through a number of different pathways. It's a central global health problem, and I look forward to working with you to explore ways to address it. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hess. That was really an absorbing and slightly alarming presentation. So I'll thank you so much. It's been so wonderful. So I'll open the floor. Margarita, go ahead.
Oh, I have to temper my voice that I don't sound too passionate, right? So I am Margarita Elliott, and I would have spent like about 4 years as the HIV coordinator across at the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Marine Resources. And at first, when I saw the posting and somebody was saying, Margaret, this is something that you could do, because I don't think this is one sector that I ever really considered, you know, the connection between agriculture and HIV. So I took it upon myself as a challenge. I applied and got through. But what I would say, from where I sit now, I've done a lot more work. I've also done some research and that kind of thing. I've also spent some years in the Red Cross movement. So from the concept of health and climate change and migration, you know, those, I think those areas are pretty developed more or less. But there seems to be a lack or gap between the intersectoral collaboration where this issue is concerned, because for someone who is HIV positive in the Trinidad and Tobago context, which is a small island development state, climate change and food security is a huge issue. So you're also reflecting on health and you're talking about climate change, but I'm not hearing food security and agriculture. So that is another sector that needs to be included in this discussion, because they also have a role to play in terms of policy, in terms of research. But even before we even get to that, who decides if this is an issue? Because at the implementation level, a lot of what gets done or paid attention to would be things that are very apparent or something you have to respond to. And my fear with Trinidad sometimes, the abstract things that really makes a difference, it gets lumped into a basket of things that we probably need to do for research. And then research is done, what happens to the research? So maybe from where you sit, what I would like to ask is, even Dr. Edwards and Dr. Boyce is sitting here, what kind of advice would you provide to them? Because this is something that is really critical. I'm sorry. It's not something that we could put on the burner to say, well, you know, we probably need to discuss this some more. I think it's extremely important because it will affect treatment outcomes of people. It will affect people's ability to their livelihoods, their ability to live a quality life. Because if you can't eat proper foods, you can't even get a meal. How can you? How in some instances will the meds work for you? So what kind of advice would you give us, Trinidad, to get a kind of exigency behind this issue? And what would be some of the recommendations you would make regarding policy and maybe an intersectoral approach and maybe for research too?
Yeah, thank you for that. I completely agree that it's very much an intersectoral issue, and that food security is a really important pathway to engage around. So what typically happens, you know, when, so I don't know a lot about Trinidad and Tobago's climate action plan, whether there is much awareness around climate change and health in that plan. And so one opportunity is to look at the national health, see whether there's been a national assessment of climate change health impacts in any national adaptation plan developed, and how much, if so, how much these issues are in that plan. Are they called out as things to pay attention to? So there are mechanisms for doing that at the national level that I would encourage us to examine and consider. And then there's the question of your programming, and you already have the expertise in this space to understand the sensitivity of people living with HIV to food insecurity, some of the levers that you could try to activate to reduce that. You may, over time, want to elevate that as an issue in the universe of interventions that you're promoting for people living with HIV or people who are at risk of contracting HIV. And then research, research is very powerful, and it can, I think it's particularly useful if you can use it to clarify the problem and then identify strategies for reducing it. And it's that pivot that needs to happen. A lot of times people spend time, like I said, showing there's a problem. And I, like you, I agree. I think we know enough to say there's a reason for concern here. We don't need to study the problem a lot more, except insofar as studying it will help us address how we can act more efficiently and more effectively. So, and I didn't come across a lot of research when I was preparing for this talk about how to address food insecurity and the dual role of climate change impacting food security and HIV/AIDS, though there is a little bit of literature, and there's one of the papers I cited highlights this for the Philippines. So I think it would be worth looking at what other people have thought through for their populations and seeing what might be transferable to your context.
Okay, thank you.
And if it's helpful to I don't know what, your ability to access some of these publications might be, whether you have access through University of Washington libraries or other things, but I'm happy to help you get access to these publications and think through next steps if that would be useful.
That would be excellent. All right. Okay, well, I think we're just about at time. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming out. It was a very balmy Wednesday evening, well, afternoon, sorry. And again, Professor Hess, thanks so much for the presentation and thanks for answering all our questions. And I think we can close off today's session. Again, with a big thank you to everyone. We will see you again in the 4th Friday of every month for next Mrftt Hiv Sti session. It will be our 92nd session. There's a few more to go before the century mark. So everyone be safe. Have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Thank you.